It's really been my life's work for the last over 20 years to work on housing and affordable housing. We have an incredible challenge in front of us to address the needs of our residents here across the Tri-County with over 30,000 new homes that we know are needed, and we need a plan for that somehow over the next several years. And so the time is now to do that, and I really want to bring up my colleague Alyssa Kroger, Director of Strategic Initiatives, Housing and Broadband, to moderate a panel to discuss housing, homelessness, and the sixth cycle RHNA.
Okay, no, click. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here today in person, no less. So my name, as Matt mentioned, is Alyssa Kroger. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Housing and Broadband with Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. I am elated and honored to be joined today on this stage with Supervisor Wendy Root Askew of Monterey County, District 4, Supervisor Betsy Dirks of San Benito County, District 1, and Genevieve Lucas Conwell, Executive Director of the Coalition of Homeless Services Providers, talking to you all today about housing, homelessness, and sixth cycle RHNA. Housing touches virtually every component of our local communities, from low-income families, seniors, and students who are housing cost burdened, to major businesses seeking to recruit and retain qualified members of the workforce. So it's no surprise that one of MBEP's core initiatives is the Housing Initiative. We advocate for an increase in production across income levels and unit types via three main buckets: our advocacy and education bucket, our Monterey Bay Housing Trust, and our employer-sponsored housing work. Currently, the housing team is working closely to provide education and advocacy around the sixth cycle RHNA process and recent state housing bills that address equity and affordability, like AB 2097, AB 2011, and SB 6. So, what is RHNA? RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And it's part of an 8-year cycle of the housing element process, which is part of a greater general plan process. The housing element has been part of the state law since 1968 and is intended to create more equitable and livable communities based on current and future housing needs as our communities evolve. The housing element sixth cycle is unique to previous cycles, as we now have AFFH, or Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing requirement. We have more robust and nuanced RHNA methodology, which determines how many homes should be built in certain areas based on resources and income levels. And we have a new housing accountability unit. Implemented in 2019 through AB 686, the housing element is now required to address AFFH, or Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, by taking meaningful action to combat discrimination in order to overcome patterns of segregation and integrate communities. The sixth cycle spans from 2023 to 2031, and it will be key for cities and counties to produce a plan that meets state approval. Otherwise, jurisdictions may face fines, loss of state funds, and even loss of local control down the road. Simply put, the sixth cycle housing element is an opportunity to not only address our current housing and homelessness crisis by planning to produce more units that everyone can benefit from in our community, but also to further break down silos, to increase regional and statewide collaboration, to engage with the community, and to get creative and courageous. With that, I'd like to open up the panel and invite the panelists to answer the following question in no more than 5 minutes each. And we'll go ahead and start with Supervisor Askew, followed by Supervisor Dirks, followed by Genevieve Lucas Conwell. And that question is, What do you think is the biggest obstacle facing local governments in achieving their RHNA goals, and how should they respond to it?
So we're going to solve housing in 5 minutes. Welcome for the ride. Nothing happens, we all know this, you all are community leaders, nothing happens in our community without 3 things lining up. And I talk about this all the time, and as Supervisor Parker before me talked about this all the time. But this power of 3, which is our public will, where we need the public to desire and to get behind and to advocate for something, where we need the political will. We need a group of electeds in whatever jurisdiction it is who are going to provide leadership and forge forward from the policy side and the vision side. And we need amazing staff who are going to get the work done. So when we talk about our housing elements, when we talk about achieving our RHNA goals, our challenge collectively is how do we align those 3 pieces of a puzzle? The RHNA goal, the local jurisdiction has the responsibility to plan for our RHNA goals, but we all know local cities, the county, we're not a developer. We're not out, I see Mayor Kerr in the audience, I see other city representatives. Like, your city does not build housing. You rely on partnerships with developers to do the actual design, construction, all of those pieces of the puzzle. But our work to plan for what's going to make it easiest, what's going to make it possible for our developers to build that housing, we need to make sure that our developers have a clear path that they can proceed without significant risk. So for our elected officials, that's one big challenge. And then on the funding side of things, I think this is another massive challenge that we're not talking about enough. We may be on track in many jurisdictions to build enough market rate housing, but we are so far behind in terms of how we're ever going to get to our very low income and our low income goals. And part of that is, how do we fund those units that arguably we desperately need in our community if we're ever going to make progress on dealing with the ensuring that everyone has a safe and legal place to sleep at night. So a couple things I'm just going to throw out, and I'm watching the time here somewhere. Do we need to think about how we fund those low-income units? Are we thinking about bonds? Are we thinking about MPUSD has a parcel in Seaside with water ready to go? They could build upwards of 300 permanently affordable units on this site if we just have the funding, right? So we need the money to move forward with it. They need the money to move forward with it. How do we fund it? So we could go out and get a bond where the community taxpayers pay for it. We need to think about the 11,000 vacant homes that are in Monterey County and think about things like a vacancy tax that other communities are looking at as a way to fund the affordable housing that we need. We need to think about our inclusionary housing ordinances. So right now we say if you're going to build, and every city has an inclusionary housing ordinance of some sort. If you're going to build 10 houses, one of those houses has to be low income, and those other 9 are going to subsidize the cost. We're never going to get to the numbers that we need to get to in terms of funding the lowest income housing units if we're only relying on the inclusionary ordinances. So we need to maybe rethink those. We need to think about employment nexus ordinances where, if a downtown is being developed, how do we make sure that there's housing to fund the types of jobs that are going to be added in that community? So there's the challenges are real, but I think when we start breaking them down and recognizing, do we have the public will to build the type of housing that we need in the locations that we need it? Do we have the political will? And each jurisdiction, we're not just talking the county, we're talking about 12 cities in Monterey County, plus Santa Cruz County, plus San Benito County. We need public will in each one of those communities that's gonna show up and say, yes, we want low-income housing in my neighborhood, in my backyard. That's challenging because there's always someone who's gonna say no. So is the yes voice loud enough? And do we have the courage within our political leaders? Are we giving our political and elected leaders do we have their backs when they say yes? Do they know that you want them to say yes? Do they know that you welcome affordable housing in your community? There's many other sort of big challenges in terms of what types of housing is being counted as RHNA. So if we're building affordable housing by design, say ADUs in a backyard, those may be beneficial, but they're not actually counting towards our RHNA numbers in all cases. So a whole nother conversation about what actually counts as RHNA. But I think I just laid out my big picture thoughts about what some of the big challenges we're facing.
Stay tuned for Housing Panel Round 2 on Does ADU Really Work for RHNA?
In thinking about this and looking at this, I mean, Supervisor Root Askew basically stole my script, but which means, though, that we're lined up in where we're at with the concerns that we have and the things that we need to do in order to make sure that we're moving our communities forward and addressing the housing crisis. And with the RHNA allocations that we do have in San Benito County, we're a much smaller county. I'm on the AMBAG board, so I've been through the RHNA process as it's been going along for Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. San Benito County, their RHNA numbers get addressed through COG, our Council of Governments, and I'm not currently sitting on that particular board, but I am on our Housing Advisory Committee, which is a new committee that our county has set up in order to help address some of the housing issues we do have in our county. It's made up of myself and Supervisor Gonzalez, and we also have an affordable housing expert on that committee from the community, and a developer on that committee, and also a finance person. So we're looking together as a community at how we can address different issues, and we just went through the process of revising our affordable housing ordinance. It's going to our planning commission, and then it's going to come up to our board of supervisors. And I think Supervisor Root Askew is exactly right. We need to make sure that as elected officials that we have the political will to do what needs to be done. And I'm fortunate in that all 5 of our supervisors are committed to affordable housing, and so we're really looking to push that forward. And one of the big things that we're doing with this new ordinance, and I think that's one of the things that we need to do to address some of the things standing in our way, is making sure that the policies we have are going to back us up. So not only do we have community involvement to back us up, but we actually have policy to back us up as well. So we're really pushing to make sure in our affordable housing piece that people are actually building on-site affordable housing, and how that looks and what that looks like. We too are looking at county property that we currently own, because as we know, this is another big issue, is the affordability of building affordable homes. Probably everyone here in the room understands that process and knows how difficult it is to build affordable homes and how difficult it is to get funding. And I'm excited that Robert Rivas, with his AB 2234 bill, which looks at post-entitlement, really is going to help push that forward, and that's new legislation that just got signed. So I really think that, again, it comes back to policy, backing everything up, making sure that our communities are bought in, and that a lot of that has to do with education. About a week and a half ago, MBEP came, we did a housing element workshop, and it was really good to have lots of community members there. And I'll say there was a woman in the audience, I just was there to introduce the panel that was speaking, and I introduced myself to everyone, and I asked, this one particular woman, I knew most of the people in the room, but I didn't know her. And I was like, what brings you here today? And she said, well, I'm looking for affordable housing, or just housing, period. I've been living with my parents, living with different friends. I have 2 kids. I can rent something, I just can't find anything to rent. And so there she was, at a housing element workshop, just trying to find housing, and for her and her family. And I think that really drove home the point to all of us that were there, which was, this is why we're doing what we're doing. We need to get people into homes. And the different things that we're doing to do that really matters. And so as we move forward, we need to move forward quickly too, because we are in a crisis and we need to make sure that we're addressing the needs of all of our community members. And Supervisor Root Askew is exactly right. I think the market rate housing we all have down. It's really looking at not just single family homes, but multifamily homes and housing and how we're providing those things as well, so that every part of our community has the opportunity to be housed. And I do know a lot of us are getting pushback because I am on AMBAG, and you know, looking at the different things is infrastructure. People are worried, do we have enough water? What in San Benito County specifically, we're really worried about our roads and the infrastructure that we have. With, if anyone's been on 25 or 156 trying to get into Hollister lately, you know what we're talking about. So all of those are real, and we do need to address those as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Dirks. And Genevieve.
Thank you, both Supervisor Wendy Root Askew and Supervisor Dirks. Happy Friday, everybody. First, I'd like to say thank you to my staff and my board for entrusting me in these first 3 months as the Executive Director of the Coalition of Homeless Services Providers. It's been a wild ride, and I've loved every bit of that journey, as well as our Leadership Council. I can't forget them. I'd like to thank MBEP, Alyssa, for hosting this panel and for creating the space for these important conversations to happen. CSUMB, you have a shout out as well. Thank you for the hospitality staff as well as the event staff for hosting the space. So the coalition, our purpose and our vision is to make sure that homelessness is a rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. That means that we want people that are experiencing homelessness to be met with dignity and respect at every step of the way while they're experiencing homelessness. One of the loudest reasons as to why this population is underserved is because of the heavy layers of stigma that comes with being homeless. We've all heard the excuses: addiction, why can't they just get a job? Are they just lazy? Are they not even from here? Where are they from? Well, my role here today is to break some of those myths. The data across the board has shown us that in Monterey County alone, 85% of the folks experiencing homelessness are from Monterey County. From that total percentage, about 60% have lived in Monterey County for about 10 years. In San Benito County, 95% are from San Benito County as well. We see this across the state, that most people that are experiencing homelessness in the county that they're located in are actually from that county. It's our neighbors that we know, the people that we grew up with, that have just built up layers of trauma, and being unhoused continues those layers of trauma, becomes complex trauma. So what does that mean? And how do we even look at a solution to the complexities that is homelessness? There's no silver bullet to this answer and to this problem. It's really more of a vehicle where each and every part of that vehicle is integral to making sure the vehicle actually operates and moves. For example, who is experiencing homelessness? Who is in our streets? Who's living? Who's behind the blue tarp? We have about 20% in both counties, Monterey and San Benito County, that are under the age of 25. And we have about over 54% that are BIPOC. We have 33% in Monterey County that have experienced homelessness for over a year, which we call chronic homelessness, and 61% in San Benito County that have lived in the streets for over a year. Now, like I mentioned before, homelessness is complex, and it requires a tapestry of services to support those folks. Let me flip my page. Now, how do we go about as the coalition and the continuum of care to create a system to support those folks? Well, we created a 5-year plan to reduce homelessness by 50% in 5 years. And I'd like to give a shout out to my predecessor, Roxanne Wilson, for Raise the Roof, for putting this plan together in collaboration with our Leadership Council. It came with a lot of data and on-the-ground research as to how we can support our community here in Monterey and San Benito County. Now, what we came up with within this research and this plan that's overarching, that started in 2021 and ends in 2026, is there's 3 strategies. We want to increase stakeholder participation, which I'm hearing here today, and that includes who's not at the table, right? Folks with lived experience. It's not us, don't talk about us without us. So we've created our LEAD, our Lived Experience Advisory Directive, making sure that folks with lived experience are at the table, talking about what they need, what are they seeing on the ground. Equity framework, making sure that we're including everybody in the picture. And then also including our city councils and our jurisdictions here, making sure that if they're interested in adopting our Lead Me Home plan, that they're at the table, they get a presentation. We want them as much part of the solution as possible. Our strategy number 2 is improving homelessness response systems. So, for example, we have coordinating with our outreach workers around Monterey County, as well as how do we even assess folks' vulnerabilities? How do we prioritize the most vulnerable to get into housing as soon as possible? That's the short version of what our coordinated entry system is. But how do we make sure that we're evolving that coordinated entry system to the evolving problem that is homelessness, and making sure that that system always has room to change per the evolving problems. Number 3, service-oriented response to unsheltered homelessness, actually bringing services to the ground. So we have folks that are living in encampments and they don't know where the nearest bathroom is. They don't know when the next time they're gonna get a shower, or how do we get laundry services. So how can we expect them to actually show up to an interview and feel confident about themselves, right? Where can they shave themselves if they need to? So actually bringing services on the ground, giving them access to the services, creating a sense of stability and security in where they can find those services, as well as safe parking. In San Benito County, for example, in the last point in time count, we have 56% of folks living in RVs. Now, that being said, there's some incredible examples that we're gonna talk a little bit about, but I think I'm running out of my 5 minutes, so I'm gonna shut my mic off and give it over to Alyssa.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. Very insightful data. Really appreciate the 3 of you and your championship of housing for all in our region. So I just want to elaborate for a quick minute, following up from your points, Genevieve. I think the Housing First model just speaks so deeply to me. I personally have experienced housing insecurity with my family, especially post-2008. And ultimately, I think there was a recent New York Times article about Austin's approach to addressing homelessness, and I think it was well said, something along the lines of, how can you expect someone to learn how to swim while they're in the middle of an ocean drowning before they get a buoy? So, really appreciate your points. So on that note, we have a few more minutes left, and we have a fun speed round, potentially followed by a rapid fire round. So the speed round will consist of 2 questions, and each panelist will be invited to respond in up to 1 minute or less. So I'll start off with asking, our downtowns and commercial corridors are the primary targets for higher density affordable housing. How high should we be allowing residential buildings to go? Only up to 6 stories, or as high as feasible?
All right, I'm going to jump in.
Go for it, Wendy.
All right. So I think that's a question that only each jurisdiction can answer. And I don't, for the County of Monterey, I think it's very dependent on which community we're talking about putting housing in. But if our commitment is to equity, environment, and inclusive economics, which is, I think, up on the line here, if we agree that that's what we want, then we have to recognize and acknowledge that higher density is the only thing that's going to get us there. Continuing to sprawl out where we're going to have additional infrastructure needs, additional road needs, there's a place for that, but really, if we really are committed to these three values, we're going to have to start changing the conversation and talking about infill development and higher density infill development.
I couldn't agree more. And I really think that it is going to be based community by community. When we look at San Benito County, we have a very rural nature, and we do want to preserve those traditions, but at the same time, we need to recognize that we do have some housing needs that don't fill in those 3 things, that don't fill in equity, environment, and inclusive economics. And we do have a current building going up right now where we're going to have some mixed residential over some storefronts that are going to be right in our downtown. And we have a little bit of that existing. And I think as long as we continue to look at infill, I think that will be something that most of the community can actually get behind, because Supervisor Root Askew is exactly right. We don't want the urban sprawl, especially in our rural part of our county in San Benito.
My answer is the more housing, the better. Because, I mean, if we're talking about the people and the people that are experiencing homelessness, these are the people that are experiencing homelessness currently, right now. We're not talking about the folks that are at risk of experiencing homelessness. And how do we create more affordable housing for those that are going to be in low income, who are going to be in tight spots in some points? The pandemic was a really clear picture of the struggle that people and families are experiencing on the ground. So, although I can't speak to the policies of what that looks like and what the densities look like, my answer is simple in the sense that more housing is better. The change is the only constant, and what are the evolving needs of our community, and how do we make sure that our jurisdiction are meeting that evolving need?
Wonderful. Thank you, Genevieve. So rounding out with a few more minutes left, I think we have time for one more speed round and maybe a couple spicy rapid fires. So the next question will be, how will you ensure your jurisdiction will meet regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA, targets while fulfilling the goals of affirmatively furthering fair housing?
Fair housing. We're talking about, and just by a raise of hands, how many of you live within walking distance to a public park that has a restroom where you could take your 2-year-old, go hang out for the day? Okay, so everyone deserves to have that. And if you're talking about where families should live, there's safe sidewalks that get you to that park, access to medical care near that park, ability to walk to a grocery store or a food store where you can buy fresh fruits and vegetables. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about affirmatively fair housing. We're talking about giving everyone the opportunity to live in a space that is accessible and rich with resources, especially those children and families where they have significant needs. And if you're talking about our 2,000 homeless students in Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, and I'll say that again, we have 2,000, according to McKinney-Vento standards, homeless students in Monterey Peninsula Unified School District. Those children deserve to have housing that's safe, that's affordable, and that has access to all of the resources that they need to grow up healthy and safe.
I think when we're looking at the affirmative further fair housing, we really do need to look at, are we mixing our communities, in a way that makes sense? And so one of the things I think that really comes back, especially to our table as supervisors, is the policy piece of it. And we really need to make sure that we're holding developers accountable. And this was a part of what I just mentioned earlier about the affordable housing piece ordinance that we're revising, is really making sure that we are creating a mixed space of not just single family homes, but also multifamily homes and opportunities. Because the more we continue to mix the kind of developments that we have in our communities, the less this is going to be an issue, and maybe we wouldn't have to have legislation to support it. And we really do need to look at that, because access to services is a really big deal. Access to public open spaces is a really big deal. And making sure that there is that kind of equity within our communities. And we really need to come together between the county and the cities to make sure that we have an overarching vision of making sure that we're doing that kind of inclusivity.
I agree with everything that you both said on both ends, and what I would say is making sure that jurisdictions really, from the homelessness lens, is looking at the different levels of care that those communities need. Like I mentioned before, homelessness is complex, and people need different levels of care for the different stages of when they're experiencing homelessness. For example, chronic homelessness looks very different than somebody that's possibly escaping a DV situation, right? Possibly it's just one night that they need support. So we need to look at making sure we have emergency shelters, transitional shelter, very important. Hot note, permanent supportive housing is where housing first principles really come into play, and permanent supportive housing is really the best and most effective way to support folks with complex traumas so that they can have wraparound services when they live in permanent supportive housing.
Ed, we'll have a quick follow-up from Wendy before we wrap up.
Just a quick Up on that point, when we talk about affirmatively fair housing and we think about our very low income housing, right now we can look at shelter beds. And when you look at where the shelter beds are in Monterey County specifically, over half of them are in District 4. 40% of our shelter beds are in one city. They're in Marina. Another 9% of our shelter beds are in Seaside. And then the other 41% of our shelter beds are in Salinas. So we have three very small communities, Marina and Seaside, who are hosting about half of all shelter beds in the county. And you can argue that there are other communities that would have better resources, would have more community resources available. We need all of our communities to step up. When we talk about affirmatively fair housing, it's ensuring that the needs of our homeless residents are spread not just into single little subsets of the community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Supervisor Askew, Supervisor Dirks, and Genevieve. It was a pleasure sharing a stage with you, and I thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and I invite you to continue to have this conversation with your community, with your family, with your friends. And let's get more housing online. Show up to your planning commission, show up to your city council meetings, your board of supervisor meetings, any community meeting. Have your friends over for dinner, and let's start digging in and figuring out how we can get more housing supply online for everyone in our community. Thank you all so much.